All right, good morning. My name is Taryn Wells. Welcome to the Hawaii Department of Transportation's 2024 Protect Our Water Conference. I will be your moderator for this morning's session titled Updates to Post-Construction Program and BMP Manual. At the end of the presentation, the speakers will have a few minutes to answer your questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for this session. Jason Lau is a principal at the Limtiaco Consulting Group, where he has been working for the last 25 years. His experience includes civil site design, sewer, water, and drainage systems, and temporary and permanent BMPs. Mr. Lau is a licensed professional civil engineer in Hawaii and California, and a certified professional in erosion and sediment control. Richard Price is a professional engineer with 31 years of experience in design, construction, environmental compliance, low impact and sustainable design, and climate change issues, working for clients including ports, federal, state, and local governments, and private industries. His recent work has focused on greenhouse gas reduction planning, as well as sustainability and resilience to sea level rise. In addition to his professional environmental consulting experience, Mr. Price has lived and worked in Nepal and the former Soviet Union, where he worked within the United Nations system, constructing irrigation systems and developing economically and environmentally sustainable housing, water supply, and sanitation facilities for refugees. Please help me in welcoming Jason Lau and Richard Price.
Okay, thanks for that great introduction, and thank you all for attending today's Protect Our Water Conference. I'm Jason Lau from Limtiaco Consulting Group, and I'll be presenting some of the updates from the past year on the DOT Highways Post-Construction BMP Manual. Just as a show of hands, so I see a lot of familiar faces, but how many have either used the manual or submitted a project based on the criteria in the new manual, or attended one of the previous conferences? Okay. So we'll be going, through some of the updates that we've had recently. So for those of you who are not familiar, just as a real quick refresher, the 2015 manual, which is shown here, the new manual that was released in 2022, and some of the updates that we made. The goals itself, the main goal was to get more post-construction BMPs in the ground. And so we did that by creating criteria. We separated criteria based on the MS4 permit areas, which are the islands of Oahu and Maui, because they do have their own MS4 permit, and so they have more compliance requirements. And then for non-MS4 permit areas, which are the other neighbor islands, they have their own set of criteria, because we don't want to have the same criteria across the board, and make it too strict for everyone. So we do have separate criteria for both. And then because we want to get more post-construction BMPs in the ground, we adjusted the trigger. The 2015 manual was based on the amount of impervious area that was created by a project. But we changed that so that it's based on the amount of disturbance area. So we kind of threw a wider net, hoping to get more projects that may trigger post-construction BMPs. We're still prioritizing low-impact development. That's always preferred. And then we included spreadsheets for the checklist, the compliance tracking spreadsheet, and also the variance request form. We also changed the methodology by adjusting the formulas that are needed to calculate how much treatment area is required. We do have the links up here. If you visit the Oahu Stormwater Hawaii website, you can get some resources here. There's also a website for Stormwater Maui. If you click on the designers and contractors link, that will take you to links that you can download, reference the 2022 manual. There's also links for videos and prior conferences that you can access for guidance. There's also some videos from 2023 as well, and as the 2015 original manual too for reference. This is a slide that I've used before because it is a journey, And, we're always updating it and kind of tweaking it based on feedback we've gotten and questions. And so the initial workshops that we've done, because we did change the methodology, they're a lot more technical. So we went into the formulas and, really into the weeds about the changes. But the latest updates are more just to be, more user-friendly for the user. And so we did updates to the MS4 permit area checklist, the non-MS4 checklist, as well as the compliance tracking. And then Richard's going to talk about some of the local and nationwide trends that we've been seeing in the stormwater industry. This picture here is one of the bioswales that we've done near the H3 Leaky intersection. Some of the general changes to the post-construction BMP files that were made. So we've added several tabs along the bottom, and this is what you'll see when you open the Excel spreadsheet. So there's the overview and guidance tabs that have been added. And the intent for these is that, we want to make it easier for the user. So instead of having to flip back and forth between the actual manual and the spreadsheet, we included some tips on, how to navigate through the tabs. You'll find within the spreadsheet there are the checklists involved or included, as well as the tracking spreadsheet, variance request form, and then there's now separate files, so the user will have one file that they can fill out. And then from the DOT side, they have another spreadsheet that they use to track files on their end. And that's generally just for compliance. So the overview tab is just instructions on, what files are included. It does have some links for the Oahu and the Oahu and the Maui websites for a quick reference. And then also instructions on how to navigate through the different tabs. The guidance tab is probably the one that you're going to find the most useful. So we did add colored cells throughout the worksheet. So you'll find that the yellow ones are going to be where the user adds in their information based on their project. The green cells are the ones that are locked out because they either have formulas or they're going to be filled in automatically. And it has instructions for each of the different worksheets. So for the BMP checklist, we do have a series of steps that you follow. And apologize, we have not integrated AI yet. So you do have to fill it out, everything. There's not going to be an automatic feature, at least not yet. But you have to follow step by step, and hopefully it's pretty clear as far as what you need to do. And once again, it's mainly so that you don't have to go back to the manual, keep referring back to the manual. So we do have the fields, a lot of the terms that are used within the worksheet, and the definitions. And then also we added some steps for guidance for the compliance tracking spreadsheet. And then more descriptions and definitions. Some links are included. And then the goal for the tracking spreadsheet is to compute how much credit or deficit is resulting for your project. And then lastly, we have instructions on the variance request form. So most of the questions we have are on the, how to fill out the post-construction BMP design checklist. And these are the questions that come across either, from the DOT side or from users that we've heard. So as a reminder, so the checklist itself is required for all projects that are initiated after July 1st, 2022, that need to be reviewed by HDOT. And we do have separate checklists, so make sure you use the right one, whether you're in an MS4 permit area or a non-MS4 permit area. This picture here is a bioswale that we've done in the Alawai watershed using native planting. And I'm going to go over the MS4 permit checklist. The non-MS4 one is pretty similar. So we added some drop-down menus to make it easier to enter in information. The yellow is where you have to add in your info. And so one of the first questions we get is, how do you determine which watershed your project is located? So we added in a link. And if you click on it, it'll take you to a website, which is a GIS website. Yeah, it's pretty cool. As you scroll around, you'll find, it'll highlight the different watersheds. And it'll flash up which watershed that is. So whichever your project is, if it spans more than one, make sure you enter in all of the watersheds in that blank. And then continuing down on the checklist. So step 1 is intended to determine whether your project is exempt from implementing post-construction BMPs. So the first question is, does your project discharge into the HDOT MS4? If not, your project is exempt. That's pretty easy. One of the questions that we've always been getting is this about erosion and sediment control. So to go through the exemptions, if your project includes work that is not included on one of these exemptions, then it needs to be assessed for post-construction BMPs. So even though your project has erosion sediment control, you're not automatically exempt. So for example, if you're doing a 2-lane road, just because your project has erosion sediment control, it's not exempt. So you need to indicate all of the items that are within your project. If your project is exempt, you continue down to step 8. If not, you continue to the following steps, number 2. Okay, and then these are more steps that you follow to determine what is needed for your project. One of the other questions we get is, how do you know if your project is within or drains into a sensitive receiving water? So we added another tab here for watersheds. So based on your watershed of your project, each watershed has a priority ranking, and if you have a priority of 3 or 4, those are considered as a sensitive receiving water. And then these rankings are based on the State of Hawaii Water Quality Monitoring and Assessment Report. It's updated every 2 years by Department of Health. And they do a series of testing for pollutants, and that's how they come up with their ratings. There's a link here if you want to take a look at it. The signature from the designer should be someone who's knowledgeable of the project. We want to make sure that information that's provided is accurate. And then the steps down below is for the HDOT reviewer. Initially, we had three outcomes, but we added this 4th one. So the different outcomes are, the first one is if your project does require post-construction BMPs. If it does meet it, you're fine. The second option that we have highlighted here is the new one that we added. So some projects do not require post-construction BMPs, but they do include it anyway to get the credit. So we do want to capture that credit for compliance. So that option has been added. And options number 3 and 4 is if the project does not meet the criteria. The options either you have to go back to the drawing board, add more BMPs, or if the DOT thinks that you're okay because there's either constraints that prevent you from meeting that requirement, then your project may be open to using alternative compliance. And alternative compliance is basically using another project in the future to address the deficit. And then for the reviewer, we also added another signature block for DOT branch head to sign. In addition to making the files more user-friendly, we're trying to cut down on the paperwork. So one of the comments we had was for the post-construction BMP compliance tracking spreadsheet. Before, every project that submitted for review needed to submit this as well. But we've kind of narrowed it down, so you only submit this if your project is required to implement post-construction BMPs, or if your project is not required, but you're adding them in to get the credit. We want to get the credit. So those are the projects that need to submit this spreadsheet. And then the BMP variance request form. So if your project is required to implement BMPs but do not meet the required treatment area, this is just your way to justify why it does not meet that. And then the DOT is going to review it, and then if you're going to approve it, you could be open to using the alternative compliance option. As far as the timing, so we anticipate updating the files and the manual itself and have them ready for public use, either first quarter of 2025 or the first half of 2025. and then some of the treatments that have been done recently. A lot of these are just retrofits. So we have outlet filter boxes. The bottom left is a sediment basin that captured a lot of sediment from along the H3. And we've done several base yard improvements where we have a lot of trash and debris that come through the site. So we filtered it through a baffle box just to improve the water quality. Okay, so next up is Richard Price, who's from EA Engineering.
Thank you, Jason. It's good to be here today and see all of you. I'm going to talk a little bit about trends in, I guess, municipal permitting, but specific to our permanent BMP program. And I tend to get excited when I talk and jump around. So if I start getting over here and you can't hear me, throw something at me, and I'll try and remember what I'm supposed to be doing. When we talk about post-construction BMPs, the requirements vary state by state. There's kind of different approaches to the permitting that drive it. In a lot of states, the regulatory agency, equivalent to the Department of Health here, they write their own compliance manual. And like in the state of Washington, I live in Seattle, they have a very detailed 4-volume stormwater management program guidance that includes a whole section on the permanent BMPs. And then they actually even allow local municipalities to create their own manual as long as it's at least as stringent as the state manual. So you have the state manual, and then you have the City of Seattle manual that adds some new twists and turns to it. And then, so depending on where your project is, you have to comply with all of these different regulations. So it can get kind of complicated. And typically, with that type of system, the DOTs address their requirements in their existing, drainage or design manual, where they just kind of direct you back to the relevant manual or to get the details on designing permanent BMPs. Another type is what we have here in Hawaii, where the DOH doesn't give us explicit direction on how to do it, but rather they tell the permittee to develop a program and implement it. And so we've developed a post-construction BMP program and the manual that goes along with it. And Jason has done a great job, I think, of streamlining the form so it will be a more straightforward process for us in the future. And then there's some places where it's kind of a hybrid of the two, where the state provides some level of guidance, and then so there's kind of, bits and pieces of the manual here and bits and pieces there, but it's, it can vary, and that does implement how you implement and how you run your program. In terms of trends that we're seeing in post-construction BMPs, anyone here that's been working under a stormwater permit for more than 5 years has seen the process where every time you get a new permit, they tighten the screws a little bit, and things get tougher, and there's more requirements and new things you have to add, and it's true in the permanent BMP world. One of the things that's a trend across the country, I think, is reducing the size of the trigger for your project. The City of Seattle, for example, if you have 750 square feet of disturbed area, it requires drainage review, and they have a whole green stormwater infrastructure, LID checklist that you have to go through and prove that, well, no, I can't do permeable pavers, I can't do rainwater harvesting, I can't do rain garden or whatever the other options might be before you're allowed to get an exemption and go forward. Within that review, they have sort of multiple trigger levels, because that's just the That's just the simple green stormwater review. But if you then have 2,000 square feet of new or replaced impervious area, then you're required to do like permanent BMPs, as we think of, like a contact storm filter, or any one of these other treatments, either in addition to or as an amendment to the LID work that you do. And I mean, part of this process, I don't know how many people here have designed a project, and in the final review, you managed to bring the disturbed area down to 0.96 acres, so you didn't have to get a permit. And they're doing that by putting a smaller trigger in there so they can look at your project. So rather than you claiming that you're 0.96 and not submitting it, by having the smaller trigger level, they get to look at your project and come back to you and say, well, we looked at this and we think when you add in your laydown area, you're going to be over an acre or over, in their case, the 2,000 square feet. So they're keeping their eyes on you. They also have different levels of triggers for either how much disturbed land you have, how much new or replaced hard surface you have, and they differentiate between hard surface and pollutant generating hard surface. So rooftops and sidewalks and a basketball court are hard surface, but the parking lot, the roadways, anything that you're driving cars on, running equipment, a container yard at the port is a pollutant generating hard surface, and there's different requirements for that. So it's getting more and more complex in how you do it. They also will nick you for what they call vegetation conversion. If you're developing, truly undeveloped land, so you're cutting down the forest and coming back and building a subdivision, the lawn that you create, you gets an impervious area account for it, because a grass lawn absorbs less rainwater than the original forest that was there. And then also finally, the intended use of the property. If you're already developing it, they have different designations in different states, but they'll call it high use or industrial use. If you have, I think it's more than 5,000 vehicles a day traveling into it, it becomes a high-use area and automatically triggers other treatment things like oil water separators and some of those things. And then the figure you see here is just from, I believe this is from Pennsylvania actually, but the other thing you'll see is the sort of dividing it up into different sizes, from a very small, a small, and a large, and the different requirements that go with those. And I don't expect you to read this flow chart, but this is the simplified flow chart for the City of Seattle permanent BMP permitting process that we developed for one of our clients. And it's mind-boggling even for me, and I developed it and I understand what all those things mean. So it gets complicated fast. And this isn't even the whole flow chart, because if you get to the wrong box on this one, then it sends you to this flow chart and you've got to work your way through it. So it's an involved process. So I think, the word for the wise is, in the future, you can probably only expect that you're going to see interest from the regulators in seeing you do more and adding complexity to how you do this. So I guess just for those of you who are not as happy with Jason's spreadsheets and the requirements that we have in there now, realize that we're still getting away pretty easily here in Hawaii. So then I want to talk a little bit about types of BMPs that we're seeing. All across the mainland, we're seeing more and more what we call regional treatment facilities. So this will be typically where the city comes in and builds a treatment facility that covers 40 or 50 square block area. In some cases like this, I believe, is a retrofit system where they're doing this. they had a piece of land and they were able to channel the stormwater from a large area to it and provide treatment in one spot. The other way that this is often done is a developer will come in and put in a regional treatment system that treats a whole huge area, even if they're not developing it all today. Very similar to the credit program that Jason was talking about, in that they will, if they have a 40-acre site, they'll put in the treatment for the entire site, and it may take them 5 years to develop that all out, but they don't have to do, if they have in this 5 years, they might develop, 10 acres, and then they do 10 acres over here, and then they get another tenant that wants to build a warehouse, and they already have all of that covered, so it facilitates their business process very well. And typically, you see greatly reduced costs, because instead of trying to build 20 little small rain gardens and fit them into the site that you have available, it allows you to, a larger scale and generally lower cost. The other trend in this is what they call stormwater parks. And these can range, probably the most common one I've seen is soccer fields that are set up in such a way that the elevations and the floodplains in a really large storm, they're able to divert stormwater and flood the soccer field 6 inches or a foot deep, but that's a whole lot of water that you're able to retain and infiltrate or at least release slowly back into the stream so that you avoid the impacts of the large flows. The project I'm highlighting here, looks like I lost some of my numbers off the side, but this is in the city of Tacoma, and they retrofitted a whole large area. I believe it's 754 acres that drain to this facility. And it's a series of sort of infiltration rain gardens. And anyone here ever been to China or Japan? Lo and behold, it took us 2,000 years to come back to the idea of terracing our treatment down the hill so that we could, we get some treatment and then we drop it down into the next one, and it just stair-steps its way down the hill. And it's in a park there, and sort of provides a visual amenity to the park, because you've got the variation in the plants and the pathways through it. But I just thought that was an interesting facility. Again, this thing can treat 8 million gallons a day. So your cost benefit is greatly increased, I think. And then I wanted to touch a little bit on new trends and permits that are maybe not yet affecting our post-construction BMPs, but will be soon. In Washington, our latest municipal permit has a requirement for avoiding disturbing PCBs and materials. Now, I thought we stopped using PCBs a long time ago, right? We took them all out of the transformers and put double containment on everything that does still have them, and I didn't think it was an issue. I didn't even realize that back in the 50s and the 60s, PCBs were put into caulk and siding material and like window gaskets. And so we now have a prohibition against pressure washing the outside of a building unless you've tested the materials to make sure there's no PCBs in them, because that caulk is now breaking down, and when you pressure wash it, you're blowing pieces out, and the PCBs are leaching out of it. It was an eye-opener to me, because like I said, I've been an environmental professional for 30 years, and I kind of thought there's a lot of legacy PCBs that we're still cleaning up because they're there forever, but they're now cracking down on it in stormwater permits as a pollutant of concern. TMDLs, I don't want to talk about a lot. I think you're all very familiar with them. Hawaii's been at the forefront of developing TMDLs, I think. A lot of other states are only just now more aggressively implementing TMDLs, and so it's a new issue in a lot of other states. For better or for worse, you're already up to your neck in them, so you're familiar with the process. And then trash reduction, and again, this is one that a lot of cities in California and Hawaii are dealing with. Region 9 has led the charge on this. You know, again, the permit just says, go figure out how bad your problem is and fix it, rather than them trying to set a number and tell you how to do it and when to do it. And then, oh, I'm sorry, the multiple trigger requirements is a typo there. I wanted to talk about what we call emerging contaminants of concern. Probably most of you have heard of PFAS. I think our keynote speaker mentioned it today. The EPA set a standard in drinking water for PFAS this year, and the number they came up with, I believe it's 4 parts per trillion, and that was only because that was the lowest number they could detect in sampling. So when they develop a better sampling technique, that number is liable to go down. And while they're, at this point, sampling it only in, or they're requiring compliance only in drinking water, you're starting to see stormwater permits, the Washington State Industrial Stormwater Permit, your Appendix B, that will be effective January 1st, has a sample-only requirement. So they're requiring everyone to sample it and just give them the information so that they'll have the numbers so that you can expect in 5 years in the next permit cycle, they're going to write it into the permit that thou shalt not exceed. And you know, we have not really sampled PFAS that much. We don't really know where all it is. You know, we've eliminated it in a lot of places, but it's one of those things that sticks around and is very mobile and very soluble in water. It's going to be an issue. And then finally, has anyone here heard of 6-ppd quinone? It's really only been an issue so far in, I think, Washington, Oregon, maybe Northern California. It's an antioxidant that they put in tires. How many of you are old enough to remember when your tires used to get cracks in the sidewall after about 5 years? They don't do that anymore because they put this 6-ppd chemical in them, and it prevents the UV light from oxidizing the rubber in the tires. Unfortunately, the 6-ppd breaks down into something called quinone that in very, very low concentrations kills coho salmon. I mean, like that. And they only discovered it when they started restoring some of the urban salmon streams in the Pacific Northwest. And they would get a good return of salmon, they'd be all excited, and then they'd get a big rainstorm, and all the fish in the stream would just die and float downstream. And it took them about 10 years of a lot of good chemistry to try and figure out what it was in the urban stormwater that was killing the salmon. It's a particular issue because it only kills, I think, it affects 2 species of salmon and brook trout and maybe one other fish that they know so far. But we really have no idea how much it's affecting, you know, the bugs and the critters in the stream. And you're going to hear more about it. They're doing much more testing all around the world. I haven't heard of anyone in Hawaii working with it, but I'm sure someone is looking into it. The good news is it seems to be filtered out pretty well with bioretention, like rain gardens, and that compost sand mix soil mixture seems to sorb the stuff out pretty well. So that's going to be a big push, at least in Washington, we'll see. And then I've just got a few pictures to show you of sort of some innovative BMPs. The Port of Seattle does a lot of work with oyster shells for treating metals. You tend to need pretty long contact time, but they put it in catch basins, and they do barrels of oyster shells that they put under downspouts typically when they have a galvanized metal roof. And then there's a little rain garden in a box. It's called a Gradix because this was developed at the Port of Vancouver, Washington, and it was Mary Gradix and Matt Graves that sort of pieced this thing together. And you can see the cross section there. It's got layers of of compost, and then bioretention soil, and sand, and gravel, and then an under drain, so that you're, again, you can put it under a downspout. I've used these where we pump water out of a manhole into the box, and the plants take up some of the pollutants, and they're very effective. And then I'm seeing a lot of people doing sort of custom versions like that Gradix box, whether it's in an existing, I've seen a number of locations where they spent $1 million on a fancy brand name filter device to treat their stormwater, and it didn't get them to the levels they needed for their permit compliance. And so they've ripped out the guts of the thing and just used the concrete box that's there, and they're putting in different layers of materials with everything from oyster shells. Biochar is the new silver bullet in stormwater treatment, which is, it's kind of like, it's basically charcoal. They do it a lot with things like walnut shells, and you need to get the right sort of consistency to have enough surface area, but not ground so fine that it then doesn't let the water go through, so you get the flow through. But it's an interesting process, and there's a lot of people that have given up on buying expensive treatment, and they're just experimenting with their own stuff, and then redoing it until they get it right and find one that works for whatever their pollutant stream is. So I think it's an interesting idea.